Picture this. You're walking through a medieval town square in the year 1300, and right there in the middle of the plaza, painted on the public fountain, is a massive tree decorated with, well, let's just say, anatomical ornaments that would make a modern mayor resign immediately. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where sexual attitudes were nothing like what you've been taught in history class. You've probably been told that medieval people were sexually repressed, controlled by the church, living in constant shame and guilt about their bodies. That they covered themselves head to toe, never spoke about sex, and lived in a world of strict moral control. Well, guess what? That's complete nonsense. The medieval world was actually less sexually repressed than the Renaissance, the early modern period, and in many ways, even less prudish than we are today. Let me blow your mind with something. In medieval literature, people talked about sex with a frankness that would make modern publishers blush. They used words for body parts that we still can't say on television. Medieval writers didn't dance around the subject with euphemisms and metaphors. They just said it, straight up. No asterisks needed. Take the French fabliaux from the 1200s. These weren't hidden manuscripts locked away in some monastery. These were popular entertainment, like Netflix shows of their time, and they were absolutely filthy. These stories were told with words so crude that even Boccaccio, writing a century later, wouldn't dare use them anymore. The French of the 1200s had no such hesitation. They called body parts by names we still can't say on television, and they did it in stories performed in public squares and noble halls. This wasn't underground literature. This was mainstream entertainment. People told these stories at taverns, at markets, in noble courts. Nobody clutched their pearls. Nobody fainted. It was just funny. But here's the thing. Medieval people weren't careless about sex. They had rules, lots of rules. But these rules were practical, not prudish. The church said married couples should have sex regularly, not just for procreation, but because both partners had a right to it. They called it the conjugal debt. If your spouse wanted sex, you were religiously obligated to provide it. Refusing your partner was actually considered a sin. Think about that for a second. The medieval Catholic Church, which we imagine as this force of sexual repression, was literally telling married couples they had to have sex whenever their partner asked for it. Medieval theologians wrote detailed discussions about this. They debated frequency, timing, positions, everything. Nothing was off the table for discussion. And women? Women were considered just as sexually interested as men, maybe more so. Medieval medical texts claimed women needed regular sexual release for their health. They believed that without it, women could develop a condition called suffocation of the womb, where the uterus would literally wander around the body, causing problems. The cure? More sex. Doctors would actually prescribe it. Medieval people even discussed these things in church, literally. The famous Romance of the Rose, the most popular book of the entire medieval period, includes a lengthy philosophical debate about whether certain words for genitals are inherently dirty or if they're just words. The character of Reason, portrayed as a wise woman, argues that since God created these body parts for important purposes, there's nothing shameful about calling them by their proper names. This book wasn't some underground text. It was the medieval equivalent of Harry Potter in terms of popularity. Everyone read it. It was translated into every European language. In Italy, it might have even been translated by Dante himself. And it contained discussions about genitalia that would never make it into a modern bestseller. You want to know what really shows how different medieval sexuality was? Public art. And I'm not talking about hidden away in some private collection. I'm talking about churches, the holiest places in medieval society. Gothic cathedrals had gargoyles and decorative capitals carved with sexual scenes, couples in compromising positions, naked figures doing things that would definitely not make it onto a modern church bulletin. There's a fresco by Giotto, one of the most celebrated artists of the Middle Ages, in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. It's supposed to represent injustice and its consequences. And right there, painted on a church wall, is a scene of a woman being stripped and possibly assaulted by brigands. Not implied, not suggested, explicitly shown. Because medieval people believed if you wanted to teach about evil, you had to show evil. You couldn't pretend it didn't exist. Medieval people also understood that marriage wasn't always about love or even attraction. Marriages were economic and political arrangements. Everyone knew this, so they had social safety valves. Courts of love, where noble ladies would judge cases of romantic affairs. The tradition of courtly love, where knights would dedicate themselves to married ladies they could never actually have. And yes, plenty of actual affairs that everyone knew about but politely ignored as long as people were discreet. Here's something that'll really mess with your assumptions. Medieval people had sex manuals, detailed ones, with illustrations. These weren't considered pornographic, they were medical texts. Priests would actually give them to newlyweds to ensure a healthy marriage. They included advice on positions, timing, how to ensure both partners enjoyed themselves, and how to conceive children of a specific gender. The medieval church's main concern about sex wasn't that people were having it. It was when and how they were having it. You couldn't have sex during Lent or Advent or on Sundays or feast days or fast days. When you add it all up, there were only about half the days of the year when sex was technically allowed. But here's the thing, nobody actually followed all these rules. Even the church knew this. That's why they had confession. You'd sin, you'd confess, you'd do penance, and the cycle would continue. And the penances for sexual sins? They were surprisingly light. Masturbation might get you a few days of fasting. Adultery, maybe a few weeks. Compare that to eating meat on a fast day, which could get you months of penance. The church was way more concerned about dietary violations than sexual ones. The language medieval people used about sex would shock modern readers. They didn't use euphemisms or medical terms. They used the crude, direct words that we still consider vulgar today. And they used them everywhere. In court documents, in literature, in casual conversation. There's a French medieval text where a mother is trying to teach her 14-year-old daughter not to use crude words for male anatomy. The daughter responds that she hears her brother and the servants use these words all the time, so why can't she? The only answer the mother can give is that proper ladies just don't say such things. But even that was changing. By the time we get to Boccaccio in the 1350s, he's already starting to use more euphemisms, more indirect language. The Renaissance, with its classical pretensions and its emphasis on refinement, would bring in a whole new level of linguistic prudishness. The same people who celebrated the human form in art would clutch their pearls at words medieval peasants threw around casually. The medieval sense of humor was earthy, crude, and completely unapologetic. You know what's really interesting? Medieval women had more sexual agency in some ways than women in later periods. A medieval woman could publicly demand that her husband fulfill his conjugal duties. She could take him to church court if he didn't. The court would actually investigate, sometimes in embarrassingly thorough detail. There are court records of wives complaining that their husbands were impotent, and the court would appoint a committee of matrons to examine the husband and test his capabilities. Can you imagine that happening in Victorian England? Or even today? A woman going to court to demand her husband perform sexually, and the court taking it seriously enough to investigate? The transformation to the prudish, repressed sexuality we associate with traditional values didn't happen until later. The Renaissance brought classical ideals of refinement. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation brought religious anxiety and moral panic. The early modern period brought witch hunts and new forms of social control. By the time we get to the Victorians, sexuality had been locked away behind so many layers of propriety that they literally covered piano legs because they were too suggestive. But medieval people, they lived in a world where sex was part of life. Complicated, sometimes problematic, but not shameful. They talked about it, joked about it, regulated it, celebrated it, and incorporated it into their art, literature, and even their religion in ways that would shock their supposedly more enlightened descendants. The medieval world wasn't a sexual paradise. Rape was common, especially in warfare. Women had limited rights in many areas. Sexual violence was often treated as a property crime against a woman's husband or father rather than a crime against a woman herself. But in terms of attitudes toward consensual sexuality, medieval people were remarkably open, honest, and practical. So the next time someone tells you about the sexually repressed Middle Ages, you can tell them about the tree of penises painted on the town fountain, about Boccaccio's lusty wives and understanding husbands, about the church courts investigating conjugal debt and the medical texts prescribing orgasms for women's health. The Middle Ages weren't the Dark Ages when it came to sex. If anything, they were remarkably enlightened. It was the supposedly sophisticated periods that came after that brought in the shame, the silence, and the repression we still struggle with today. Medieval people knew sex was a part of life, and they dealt with it accordingly, with humor, honesty, and a refreshing lack of prudishness that we could probably learn from today. If you enjoyed discovering the surprisingly spicy truth about medieval sexuality, hit that like button and subscribe for more history that'll completely change how you see the past. Because trust me, everything you learned in school was just a sanitized version. The real history is so much more interesting.